Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and you're joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Burtram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing great. Thanks, Will.
And today, on Halloween, we have with us a special guest. It's Professor Tanya Luhrmann. She's a Stanford anthropologist known for her work on how people experience the supernatural, with a focus on religious practices and beliefs. And today, we are talking to her about witches. So, welcome to the show, Tanya.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's so cool to have a bipartisan podcast.
It really is. Yeah. I mean, like, we like it and we hope our audience
Thank
likes
you.
it. Well, they must like it if they're tuning in to us, I guess. But I did not do your resume any justice whatsoever. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about yourself, Tanya. How did you get into this like world of supernatural stuff?
I'm an anthropologist, as you said. And when I was I grew up kind of betwixt and between faiths. So my mom's dad was a Baptist pastor. My dad's dad was a Christian Scientist. My dad went to medical school, which you're really not supposed to do as a Christian Scientist. I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. And so I knew that there were all these kind of good, kind, wise people with very different commitments to what was, to what was real, to the nature of reality. And when I went to graduate school, I was hanging out with philosophers, and the book that the philosophers really liked in anthropology was a book about witchcraft. It was this famous book called Witchcraft, Oracles, and Magic Among the Azande. And I thought it would be kind of cool because it spoke to me. There's this idea that there were these invisible forces that some people recognized. And, many readers of the book said, no, obviously those don't exist. And the philosophical debates about the book were really, really about science. You can find people believe in witchcraft and mysterious forces in non-modern societies or non-literate societies, but not in ours. And so how do we make sense of that? And I knew that there were people who called themselves witches in London. And so I was doing my degree over in the UK at Cambridge. And so I decided to go kind of hang out with these witches. The philosophical debates were all about belief. But what I found when I hung out with these people who call themselves witches is that people experienced magic. They felt the power in their body. And so that just created this rabbit that I've been following for years. I try to be agnostic about about the real reality of the supernatural. And if it's real, for whom is it real? Did it show up here but not there? I try not to go down that path. But I do ask in a study in witchcraft, a long study with evangelical Christians and people who create invisible friends called tulpomancers. And there's another piece of my life where I study psychosis or madness as well. I try to figure out, under what circumstances do people have these experiences and how do they think about them? And why do they happen to some people and not to other people? And, and then what's the social context in which all of these people are having these experiences? So that's me.
I'm like so amazed. I feel like if I were a student at Stanford, I would be nipping at the bit to take whatever courses that you're teaching. It just sounds super.
Witches
super
101.
Yeah,
I'm kidding. That was dumb.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so maybe this is a philosophical question I'm going to ask you, but it may not seem philosophical, but for the description you just gave us. And are witches real?
So one answer to that question is that witchcraft is a practice for real humans only after about 1920 in the West. So before 1920, the way anthropologists would typically talk about it is that people get accused of being witches. So you get different kind of social worlds. I've spent some time in Ghana. People are very involved with the idea of witchcraft in Ghana. In different social worlds, like contemporary Ghana, there is a sense that there is bad supernatural power that some people, rather than other people, different. And the idea of witches is pretty common around the world. So almost many societies, particularly agricultural societies, have had ideas about humans who are witches. Anthropologists think that these systems of ideas emerged in agricultural communities because if you farm the land, you're stuck on the land, right? You don't pick up a field in the next village. You've got your land where you have your land. And so if you have, in that kind of world, there's plenty of conflict with your neighbors. And so ideas about witchcraft are ideas about sort of the mystical power of anger and envy. These ideas kind of arise in what one anthropologist called the social strains of a community. So people who have good reason to be angry at each other because maybe they're sharing water rights, or maybe they, like in New England, early New England, the arguments. Some people, the historians, think that the people who accused each other of being witches were people who were having an argument about whether there should be a new church built in a particular land, in a kind of in a sub-village. You've got, you have an argument, and these accusations of malevolent power go back and forth across the lines of the argument. Anyway, so the humans that you can point to and say, oh, they're practicing a religion called witchcraft, that emerges 1920, really develops a kind of power in 1960, 1970, when sort of religion breaks open as a social opportunity. So you don't, if you're an American, if you're English, it's not necessarily expected that you'll be a Christian. There's an opportunity to be a person of different kinds of faith. Witchcraft as a practice emerged then, and then it was a kind of a worship of the world. It was this of the natural world. It was a pagan practice. It was people talked about the great goddess and the god of the hunt, and they came together in small groups. They called covens. So that's a thing. That's the world that I studied in London back in the 80s. And there are thousands and thousands of people who join in small groups called covens to worship the great goddess and her expression as the goddess of the moon, the goddess of the land, set of ideas that really draws on our thinking about pre-modern Europe and pre-modern America. The idea of witchcraft as something people are accused of, that's in many societies. People didn't practice that. People got accused of it. The complicated question, and this would be for our pastor, would be whether it's ever possible for people to have angry or envious thoughts that have a kind of supernatural reality. And churches have different points of view about that. Sometimes, these days they don't call it witchcraft. They talk about demon possession, or they talk about something else. But that's the kind of, anyway, so those are the two things. There's a set of ideas about supernatural, malevolent power, and then there's a modern pagan practice.
In today's modern society, they use the term, I think, Democrats, if I'm saying that correctly.
Democrats, Democrats. No. We joke, of course. So I love this. I love this conversation because, when I grew up thinking of witches, there's this idea of course, like the stereotypical, like if someone's on a broom, they got a big hat, they're making some brew that they're putting together, whatever it is, and they're casting spells.
Yeah.
right? So there's this idea of this, this woman, many times older woman, that has kind of is decrepit, but has these powers, is to be feared, right? And it's just the kind of this almost like clearly like once you get older in the Western context, at least in my context, it's like, well, yeah, that's obviously those are made up. It's in the same kind of thing as dragons or, something else along those lines. And yet, what's fascinating to me is that, right, the Old Testament of the Bible deals with witchcraft, at least witchcraft in its context, which I imagine is different in some ways than ours in our context. And even, there's a famous story about one of the kings of the Old Testament, Samuel, going and visiting a witch, an Endor, who can call forth the dead. And she calls forth Samuel, this prophet in the story, and and he comes up from the dead, and Saul talks to him, and Saul had made witches illegal, and it's a really interesting thing. But I'm imagining like witches in an ancient context, and I'm imagining witches today, and it sounds like very much what really witchcraft is there's this really deep religious motivation, energy that has its own beliefs. But like you said, the experience of it, and I don't think that's very different than most people. Most people believe the things that they experience, or that feel true to their experience, right? And I would love for you to kind of talk about, I mean, anything that I've talked about that you wanted to hit on,
Yeah.
but what is this progression of the image of witches that's happened through history?
So that's a really good point. So there's a set of ideas that tends to circle around what we come to call in English a witch. And most of these ideas, until you hit like the 1920s, are ideas about somebody else. Sometimes they're ideas that these people work together in a group. These ideas tend to be that, they're women, either old, non-sexual women or beautiful young women. So in Scotland and in the early modern period, the witch was more likely to be imagined as a young and beautiful. When the witch has power, the idea that people will say, well, it's really power around sexuality, fertility. So a witch would blight domestic animals, or she'd blight crops, or she'd sort of prevent a family from having a child. She'd make it impossible, so Henry VIII accused Anne Boleyn of being a witch, and he said because he had this fantasy that she prevented him from being able to have sex with her. So, and these ideas kind of circulate around what a family needs to survive. You need to eat, you need to have your animals, you need to grow your vegetables, you got to have your kids. And so there's this cluster of ideas about this malevolent power that zapped people. And it got elaborated and expressed in different societies, different agricultural communities in different ways, and sort of, and it sort of acquired its form in probably around the Inquisition in Europe. Like in the 9th century, the idea of believing in a witch in Europe was, in some settings, it was illegal, because to believe in a witch sort of meant that a witch kind of had power over Christians. And that was kind of seemed like a bad idea, seemed like something you shouldn't believe in. And then, this is the way some historians think, that as the Inquisition got underway and people were kind of, going into small communities and asking people what they thought, these kind of, early agricultural ideas about this power to blight other people's bodies cropped up, and it sort of was codified into a set of ideas that included brooms and the devil who looked like a goat, and and cauldrons and flying through the night, and that became the kind of the idea that really emerged and became associated with Halloween, this kind of this day in the church's calendar where the boundary between the worlds grows thin. So what happened in the 20th century is that people got secular, and that big shift and huge shift in human experience. And so, and as people secularized, Halloween became kind of fun. Nobody believed in witchcraft, so it was fun to dress up as a ghost and as a witch. You got little pop-up houses. I mean, nobody's going to sell that pop-up haunted house if they think that ghosts are real, right? You don't want to attract the ghosts. So witchcraft becomes like defanged. People don't really take it so seriously. So there's all this stuff. Early modern Europe, for a variety of reasons, somehow these ideas get out of hand, and thousands of people get killed. A bunch of 19, 20, around that number got killed in Salem, but a bunch of people also get killed in New England. It's like people get killed when there's an argument over something, or something bad happens, and somebody's cow dies, and they blame the person they think is their enemy. And then somehow this kind of small community coalesces and decides that person is to blame, and then they kill that person. The 20th century thing is, as you say, I think people get drawn to, it becomes a way of having a faith when, for whatever reason, people turn away from the idea of Christianity or Judaism or whatever. And like now, modern witchcraft is, it's fun. It's a practice where people experience themselves as honoring the earth. They do spells, they cast spells, they do rituals, they conjure power. Often they're doing things with the power, like trying to cure somebody's back problem, or trying to. I was in England, and people were trying to bring truth into English politics. We did a big spell about that.
Wait, can you recommend any great practitioners that can help with back problems? Because I'm a former military. I've got a really bad lower
and a
back.
spell that can heal our crazy political system. That'd be nice.
Oh man, would that be wonderful? It's I suspect there are people working on that. And the thing is that you do any faith practice. So the coven that I joined in London, that was a group of about 9-10 people. We'd get together on the full moon and on the what are called the great Sabbats, like like Halloween, or kind of May Day, or the solstices, and people would they'd do these rituals, but the rituals were really, like all religious rituals, they're really stories, and people sort of walk through the stories in their mind's eye. So people would, like my first foray into this world, we did a ritual about sacrificing something to the moon goddess, and I spent my first evening as the sacrifice, and I spent my first evening like flat, down on the floor, looking at the carpet, and I was kind of embodying the sacrifice to the moon goddess. But people talk about the story about the earth as first a young woman in the spring, and then a mature, fertile woman in the summer, and then an aging woman in the autumn, and then she becomes the crone, and then she's reborn in some way in the spring, and so there are all these stories about, and sometimes there's a story of, well, the earth, the earth goddess is like the goddess, but she's represented as Artemis, the spring goddess, or the huntress, the masculine goddess, or Demeter or Caradwen, the beautiful summer goddess, or fertile and reproductive, and she gives birth to the corn and John Barleycorn, and then and then she becomes um, she becomes Hecate, the sort of the goddess of the autumn, and and there's a cycle, and then sometimes she's just sort of eternal, and then it's the man who becomes the Adonis figure. A lot of these ideas come from Celtic and Greek and Nordic literature, and people would weave these stories together. I knew a woman who had a room that was sort of a shrine, and she had she had like 100 goddesses in her room, and she had each wall represented a season. And so she had the young, beautiful goddesses on the eastern wall, and I think the fertile goddesses on the southern wall, and the older goddesses on the western, and then the western and the northern walls, and her life was full of these stories. I mean, they're sort of the way that Christians' lives are full of stories from the Bible, and those stories help people to be inspired, to make sense of what's going on, to give them a sense of the passage and the journeys of their own life. And it was really, I mean, people sometimes talk about this as white witchcraft.
It's absolutely fascinating to me. And there it is, Will, the fascinating word. We have this thing where I say fascinating all the time when I'm not listening, if I'm like looking for another question or I'm like trying to think. But that's not what I said this time. I was listening to you and I was engaged. But I think about, so I want to try to make sure I get this question out correctly. So I was listening to a series on the history of Christianity, and of course, Christianity and witchcraft have had a very contentious relationship throughout their history. And witchcraft, anything that was kind of seen as this, anything outside of what was prescribed in the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures, and then in the New Testament and the Christian writings. And it created, especially, of course, when Christianity became powerful, right? And had the power backing of the state behind it, or had backing of government, then of course that kind of angst or that the tension turned into real hostility and animosity and violence. And it's really hard to think about that, but it's one of those things that I think Christians have to reckon with, is the violence in Christianity's past. But I'm thinking about this idea, like this, of the Black Sabbaths, and the reason I'm bringing that up is not just about the band, and maybe you can help us understand why the band was called Black Sabbath, but these ideas of these like crazy rituals where something got into people's minds, especially these Christian leaders and theologians. And I'd even heard it described in the lecture, the course on the history of Christianity, like there's almost pornographic, the things that they were writing about what happened at these Black Sabbaths. And there was always this connection with like the witches and warlocks, if there were, like the male witches, and then Satan, right? It all went back to Satan. Satan was like the leader. It's ultimately all about loving Satan and worshiping Satan, and essentially getting these forces of darkness, increasing those in order to defeat the forces of light and goodness. And I would love for you to just kind of talk about that, these concepts of Black Sabbath, kind of help us untangle what was myth in those as much as you can, and what was reality, and how much it is this idea that the occult and that, that it connects to Satan,
Yeah.
like specifically this character of Satan.
Yeah. So one way of thinking about it, and these are great questions. One way of thinking about witchcraft is that if you think that there is supernatural power, then there's going to be supernatural power that's good and supernatural power that's bad. And, one way to I think Elaine Pagels talks about this great scholar, Christianity. In the early Christian churches, as people had different ideas of like what Christianity was all about. This is back in the first century, and nothing's written down, or very little's written down, and people are just trying to figure out what this faith is going to be like. Different sects of Christians would accuse each other of being demonic or consorting with Satan or being witches. There's a sense that witchcraft and demon and Satan, it's always an available insult. And it's also something people are afraid of, because if I suppose it's possible for people to believe that the supernatural, if there are things that are supernatural, only the good is supernatural. But that tends not to be how humans have worked. People have tended to say, if it's possible to do a spiritual healing, it's possible to curse somebody. And then, so it's possible that there are people who are using this power for some negative purpose. And then if that idea gets loose in a social world, then people elaborate and develop, and they have all these ideas. And so, I think that what historians mostly think is that the idea of witchcraft was for many, many years a kind of pretty much a pagan, rural, non-Christian belief. And then somehow it got hooked onto the idea of Satan in this very developed way in the early modern period. And then people had all these fantastic ideas about it. And, one of the ways that James the Sixth of Scotland, who became James the First of England, when he took over the English throne after Elizabeth died, one of the ways that he made a claim about his authority and power as a man, as a leader, was to be kind of a witch hunter, at large. And the great witch hunter, and he would send people out and to find witches and to kill them and condemn them. I guess first condemn and then kill. But there was this period. So you have, anyway, so there's this available idea that if there's good supernatural power, there's negative supernatural power. I think that this gets its root in some very human experiences. Like when you get really, really angry, it feels like force. It feels like there's something moving through you. And I think that is kind of, it becomes available for people to think with and then to worry about. And then, if, you can, religion is sort of, no matter the faith, religion is a matter of trying to create an organized world in which you are a good person, in which you're behaving properly, and you are caring and kind to the people who matter. And humans fail at that all the time. And so, so it's sort of almost by the attempt to create a good supernatural world, you also pop up it's just so easy to pop up the opportunity to think about bad supernatural things, and it's and it becomes this little witch's brew of ghosts and bad rituals and black Sabbaths. It's like the inverse of what Christians are trying to get up to. So you have a good Christian ceremony. Well, of course, the witches are going to do a terrible Christian ceremony. They're going to put Satan at the center of the altar. They're going to have they're going to eat babies rather than to kind of consume Christ's body. And so, that people develop all these ideas.
That's fascinating, and I definitely want to dig a little bit more into kind of like the Christian witchcraft kind of tie-in, and maybe my next question does that, but I'm asking this question because I really just don't know. But like, could you kind of unpack like what the Salem witch trials were, kind of what caused them here in the United States, and maybe if there is a tie, like what role did misogyny play in the witch trials?
Well, okay, so on the misogyny point, one way of thinking about the way the idea of witchcraft gets loose in a society is that witchcraft is bad power. So people who shouldn't have power, are often women. Also, witchcraft is also often about fertility. The people who are most associated with fertility are women. And so that's not so much of an accident that these concepts become kind of intertwined. I think what was going on in Salem, is the way I read the history, is that there's this idea that's a little folkloric and people do and they really don't believe in it, but they sort of do believe in it. There's this idea that there are people who are capable of being witches. So the idea is percolating along. And for, Salem is 1691, 1692, something like that, end of the 17th century. And like for the previous 150 years, there are people who are killed in New England for being witches periodically. And it's usually like one person at a time, or, two, and it happens, and then it stops for years, and then it happens. And this is a world where news doesn't travel so fast, no telephone, no internet. Shocking thought. It's I say that jokingly, but it's pretty hard to really wrap your mind about what that social world would have been like with
Absolutely.
yeah, it's really kind of striking. Anyway, so what seems to have happened in Salem is that there were these kids who young kids, like 7, 8, 9, 10. There were kids who started talking about things they had seen. So hallucination-like experiences. I don't remember the details. Some historians think that that's because it was a rainy summer, and when it rains, rye can develop like a bacterial covering of ergot, which is a hallucinogen. And so some historians think that actually these kids were actually hallucinating. And somehow, and these kids, that their claim that they saw things that other people couldn't see. I forgot what they saw, but I think that there was, I think it pretty quickly became the idea that they saw the bodies of somebody who wasn't present. And so there's this idea that humans can project their bodies and they can be independent of their bodies. And, and that gets swept up in this idea of malevolent behavior. As the kids saw other people's bodies where they shouldn't be, and there was a fight going on between the pastor of a small, I think there was like Salem Town and Salem Village, and there was a big church in Salem Town, and this was like a little offshoot of Salem Village, and the pastor was pretty cranky, and he used these ideas to talk about the emergence of witchcraft in his community. And somehow, and I believe that there was another piece of this, in which the town was between, Massachusetts was between charters maybe. And so nothing legal. So at this point, witchcraft is a legal offense. And so people were chucked into jail. So people would be accused of being witches. And there was a sense in which people who spoke out against the witchcraft, as you couldn't kill the witch, you had to put the witch into jail. Because Massachusetts was between charters. I think there may be some historians who will howl at this representation, but there was some reason why the witches couldn't be tried initially. And so the jails became more and more full. And the reason for the accusation was something would go wrong. A cow would die, a child would become ill, somebody's back would hurt. And the person that and somebody would make an accusation, and the person that person would accuse would be somebody they didn't trust, because they were in some kind of fight with them. And people were sort of rallying their neighbors, but they were terrified, right? I mean, this is the scary feature of any faith commitment. If there is good supernatural commitment, there can be bad supernatural power. And if you really think that bad stuff can happen in your town, it is terrifying. And so they weren't able to remove the dangerous witch. And so people went into what's sometimes called a panic, a moral panic. Something bad is happening. It was whipped up by this one pastor, kind of became more and more intense. More and more people got jailed. And then they were all killed in months later. It was 6-9 months later. And again, one of the things that would happen would that people who were protesting this sometimes were identified as witches themselves. And so it became terrifying to be in the town. And then it seems to have stopped when one of the witch finders, Cotton Mather, argued against what had happened. Said, look, if we are, at this point, and that 19 people had already died, maybe one or two more. And he said he was understood to be a good Christian man. And he said, look, even if we're going to let a few people who are witches go free, if we're at risk of killing somebody who's innocent, we have to stop this. And so there was this kind of period of madness for something like under a year, but many months, and then it just stopped. And that's a little bit probably what happened on the continent as well. There are pockets about 150 years earlier in Europe, in which there are these explosions of witch finding, these hunting for witches, and they seem to be motivated in different ways. This was also a period, early 16th century, in which there's tensions about the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. So they're all, that tension between Protestantism and Catholicism. There was a sense that these other people, the people who didn't agree with you, they could actually be evil. And so the idea that they would have power would be terrifying. And of course, bad things happen to people all the time, and they want to explain them, and they want to stop the thing that's causing them. And so somehow people get into this frenzy. Terrible things happen.
Yeah.
Well, can I just make a quick comment about that? Because when you're talking, I'm just like, are you describing today? Because you've got a pastor that is sort of raising, present company excluded, Josh, but you've got this pastor that's raising a ruckus about moral issues, and a concern about folks that could potentially come into power. if everything you just said was not a microcosm of like our current political environment, I mean, I don't know what is, to be honest.
Yeah. No, I think there's something there. I mean, I think that, I think that QAnon is not is a set of ideas about wicked people doing terrible things, sexually abusing children, killing children, and it's sort of very exciting to people because it's a way of explaining things that are going wrong. There are terrible people out there doing terrible, terrible things. It's mysterious. People feel excited by trying to solve the puzzle of what's really going on. And there are these clues that seem to be left all over the internet that you need to figure out, and it makes you feel good and powerful when you figure it out. But yeah, no, I worry about this current moment because I think that there are some claims about the wickedness and evil of some ordinary humans, which are probably misplaced. I mean, I feel confident that are misplaced.
I agree. I mean, even the idea of right the Black Sabbath versus these rituals that are often accused of like this, like a cohort at the highest levels that's pedophilic, and they want to kill children and have these like, I mean, I've heard that kind of stuff, right?
Mhm.
In my circles of people that think, hey, dude, the ritualistic things they do, you can't even imagine it. And so there's this idea that it's all behind closed doors, and what they're really trying to do is they're trying to completely destroy everything that you hold dear in your life. And so we need to make sure that we get rid of this threat, because what is it doing is playing on your fears. And I've
Yes.
said this 100 times or 1,000 times, and even in sermons, like if someone knows what you're afraid of, they can control you. They can figure out how to get you to do things. That's the real witchcraft, is figuring out what people are afraid of so that you can then control them. I know that, the idea is that you're able to somehow take these supernatural powers and use them and somehow manipulate them for your own uses, good or ill or whatever. That's, people think of magic in that way, but there's this way of trying to get people to be afraid, where then you can control them as opposed to controlling the natural forces. And it comes to this good and evil.
Yeah.
It comes down to this sense of there's good, there's evil, we got to figure this out. And in Christianity, you have things like the Sermon on the Mount, you have things like the Ten Commandments that kind of like delineate this idea of like, hey, here's some major ethical, teachings and things that concepts that we should hold on to, that are foundational. I'm wondering, in your experience, what are the foundational beliefs and foundational kind of concepts, moral concepts in witchcraft and modern witchcraft, and what you've had experience with and studying and even being in community with.
So the humans who are actually practicing a religion.
Yeah.
Those are those folks are more like Gaia worshippers. So they tend to be more likely to be people who are think that trees have a kind of spirit, that we should be kind to the land, that that plastic is for them plastic is evil. It's they tend to be people who really want to return to this world in which the natural the woods and the land and the trees and the plants were alive, where there's a sort of nostalgia for a world where people and animals and the seasons kind of lived in harmony. And so they tend to be drawn to living in harmony with the land. That tends to be the kind of ethos They tend to be creative folks. They love the stories of the, so because there's this notion of there's the goddess and the god. You have this the stories that were woven out of the Celtic world or the Greek world or the Egyptian world or the Nordic world. They weave together all of these, or the Native American world, and for the folks who are in this country, people are drawn to certain of these stories in that world. And that, I mean, the woman who I described to you, who had like a room devoted to the different goddesses, she thought of herself as being too shy. And so she was really drawn to this lion-headed goddess, Egyptian goddess called Sekhmet. And I remember a ritual that we did in which she led the group, and she had us imagine that we were in our mind's eyes, using all our inner senses. We tried to, smell and see and hear and feel. She led us across kind of a fiery pit, and we were on this bridge that was like walking across this pit, and Sekhmet was on the other side. And she had us kind of look into Sekhmet's eyes and feel that we were filled with her power, that we were filled with her authority and her ability. And that helped this woman. There's this kind of therapeutic quality to a lot of modern witchcraft. People choose the myths that speak to them, that help them be the person they want to be, and then they tell themselves stories about that world. I mean, this is the world where these people are Tolkien readers and Narnia readers and probably Harry Potter readers and Philip Pullman readers. The Mists of Avalon was a book that everybody read when I was spending time in that world. It's a retelling of the Arthurian myth. And, Morgaine is actually, a powerful witch, but in a good sense. And, and she's then has this relationship with Arthur, and Arthur's trying to, Morgaine is trying to protect the Druids from the incursions from the Christians. And anyway, people get lost in those sorts of stories. That tends to be the world they live in.
I love that. So, as folks are out and about trick or treating or going to their whatever Halloween parties, I'm curious if you can give us some cool, fun facts or trivia that we can impress all of our friends with about witches. So, I mean, I'll let you sort of be the decider of what cool thing we can impress our friends with. Like, because one of the questions I had was, specifically, and I think Josh pointed to this earlier about when we envision a witch, we think pointy hat, broom, spells, cauldrons. In my wife's case, for her costume, green skin. She's planning on being Elphaba for Halloween. Like is there an origin story to maybe like why there's a broom, why there's a pointy hat, or some other kind of fun fact you can sort of blow our minds with?
Oh, that's a very hot, tall order. I don't know, but I do think that brooms go way back. They're at least early modern, so they're at least like this like 15th century ideas, European ideas about brooms and flying through the night and gathering together. I don't know. I do think that one cool observation is that ghosts used to be transparent. Ghosts used to be solid. They're now,
Really?
yeah, we now sort of imagine them as transparent. But they became transparent when photography was developed, and you could create spirit photography. You could photograph spirits with double exposure, so you could see the transparent figure over somebody's shoulder. So that's a 19th century thing.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So ghosts used to be solid.
Yeah.
So that's wait. So like solid in the sense of like I can touch them, or still like I don't
So
know.
how do I really know? So in these like 16th century records, there's there's a book called Leonard's Ghost that describes, I think it's this 17th century witch. You can see, the ghost is fully solid, and then what marks the ghost as a ghost is what she's wearing on her feet. Are there human feet, or are there other kind of feet? And so you have to look carefully to figure out whether that's actually a human or something else.
There you go, dude. That's the piece of trivia you're looking for. Well,
I know. Well, okay. So last question. So I recently just discovered Harry Potter, which I don't know. I mean, I'm close to. I'm in my late 40s. My wife, who is a pastor's kid, by the way, actually loves Harry Potter. But I just started getting into it, watch the movies, read the books. I mean, I even play the video game. I'm a gamer, Hogwarts Legacy, and I am just in love with the show Agatha all along. I'm a big Marvel fan anyway, so like just tons of witches. Like my entire world recently is just consumed by witch related stuff. And I'm curious if you have a favorite, I don't know, movie, TV show, book, something that you think either one maybe represents witches well, or is just interesting to you.
So I think the Mists of Avalon represents a witch as well, actually written by a witch in this modern sense. I think, Harry Potter, those witches have a lot of the characteristics of the folks I met in London. So there are robes. There are people I knew in London didn't have brooms. They did have spells. They loved these, early modern books like these, books of alchemy and Kabbalah and sort of magic. I mean, they're running alongside these ideas about malevolent power and people who were accused of being witches before 1920. There's also the real practitioners of high magic, people who did have spell books and who had used symbols to direct magical power. And so the witches loved that, and that's the kind of thing that Harry learns in school.
So like there really was like a ministry of magic, kind of like I don't know,
Not a
like
ministry of magic, but there were people, usually very, the people who really did exist were healing women. So people who were practicing medicine in a world without much medicine. And some of them were women. And sort of high magicians, people who were basically intellectuals and who were, Isaac Newton wrote like 1,000,000 words on alchemy. I mean, there was in a time before magical power is cleanly separated from physical power, gravitational power. There were lots of ideas about the way that which symbols and symbols could call forth certain kinds of power. So there were intellectuals who were practicing something like magic, where they were using symbols, like John Dee, who's probably was an astrologer at Queen Elizabeth's court, probably the model for Prospero and the Tempest. He's a guy who had all of these elaborate symbols, geometric symbols, and certain kinds of words, and certain kinds of, metals, and certain kinds of colors, and people would try to put those together to direct power in a particular way, to conjure direct angelic power. So that was a thing.
That's really cool. So, how can people, I guess, follow your work, learn more about you? Just kind of get plugged into some of the research and stuff that you're doing.
So I have a website called TanyaLuhrmann.com, I think. Tanya Luhrmann, anyway.
Yeah, got it.
And it's so I have some of my work up on there, and there's also a website at the Stanford Anthropology Department.
That's really awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tanya. This has been Probably
Yes.
one of my funnest interviews I think I've done in a while.
Great. Well, it was really great talking with you guys.
Yes.
And
Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you. And we will make sure we put all those links in the show notes. And to our listeners and audience, thanks again for stopping by. And as always, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care.
Take care. Good luck. Take care.